Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. I am going to forget what I was going to say. I'm going to keep that in, but because I don't edit, I'm going to respond or react, learn about philosophy today, specifically Hegelian philosophy. This book, Phenomenology of Spirit. Why? Because it seemed interesting. I don't know. I was watching a YouTube video of another, you know, YouTuber talking about philosophy stuff, and a lot of people in the comments were just talking about this specific book for some reason. I don't know why. Um, and turns out there's a whole YouTube series where a professor or whatever goes through this book page by page, paragraph by paragraph, talking about it, and reading and all this stuff. I was like, you know what? I'll check this out. And you know what will be even more interesting for me to share my learning process, to share kind of how I'm taking this stuff in as I learn it. Why? Because I don't know. I think it would be interesting. Like I would love to see other people kind of learning about these things because I think it's interesting to see that learning journey, that learning process, those gears turning in your head when you are working through a difficult, idea or subject. And I heard this book is very tough. Is very, thick and hard to get through. So yeah. I'm gonna have fun with this, and again, we'll try to keep it to 15 minutes, roughly. Probably not though, um, but we'll see. Okay, so anyways, here we go. Share my screen. I really should probably prep this before. How did I lose the screen that is on? It's not showing. Okay, here we go. I just can't read, y'all. It's okay. Okay, 15 minutes. Boom. Phenomenology
It
of
is
spirit.
customary to preface a work with an explanation of the author's aim, why he wrote the book, and the relationship in which he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading. For whatever might appropriately be said about philosophy in a preface, say a historical statement of the main drift and point of view, the general content and results, a string of random assertions and assurances about truth. None of this can be accepted as the way in which to expound philosophical truth.
Already we jumping in here. I'm not sure who is writing this preface, if it's Hegel, I hope that's how you pronounce his name, himself or somebody else. Um, but just the idea of, in the case of philosophy work, seems out. Yeah. So I'm guessing it's somebody else writing this. I don't think he ever explained who wrote the preface. So maybe he's going to explain that later. And the reason why I stopped it here is because there's something here that's interesting to me. Is like the idea of kind of explaining, the what you're gonna get into, when you read a book. I think is interesting. Before sometimes I would like I'm kind of new to the space of reading anything nonfiction. I grew up reading hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 books by now, probably a couple thousand, but most of them, the vast majority of them, was fiction. And in that area, sure they have prologues and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily a preface. Um, and those prologues are usually important to the story, adds like a kind of origin and backstory to it. I know it's not the same with fiction, with philosophy, but I could see why people typically put these sorts of things in these books because, again, it gives you an idea, kind of a background as to what's going on here. And in this case of a philosophy book that's supposed to be really thick and really difficult to kind of grasp, um, it could be useful to share more about what the author was thinking, to make sure that people can kind of follow their thought process as they go on.
Results, a string of random assertions and assurances about truth. None of this can be accepted as the way in which to expound philosophical truth. Also, since philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality, which includes within itself the particular, it might seem that here, more than in any of the other sciences, the subject matter itself and even its complete nature were expressed in the aim and the final results, the execution being, by contrast, really the unessential fact.
So this is interesting. Also, since philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality. I wonder what they mean by that because, like, as I've been learning in recent like days and weeks, this idea of universality is kind of problematic, right? This is because the whole reason I'm getting into this because I was watching videos on postmodernism. So I wonder, like, people heard people talking about it because I heard people talking about critical race theory, and apparently a lot of that comes from postmodernism. Postmodernism comes from modernism. Modernism comes from right. um, I think idealism or some other stuff, right? So, and the concept of universality, to my understanding, is what kind of modernism was sort of about, I think, and postmodernism is sort of against, sort of, kind of, roughly. Universality meaning, there is an objective truth, right? There's an objective kind of idea, morals or whatever, and our job as scientists or as people, is to get towards that truth. But as I began understanding postmodernism is more, you know, people have been trying to say that it may not be a universal objective truth, right? It might be relative. And personally, I personally think that is more accurate, and more likely, simply because, as and I've been like very interested in physics for a while, even though I'm not a physicist or any not good at math. Well, I've just been super interested in it. And to my understanding, like when you get into like quantum physics and relativity, stuff like that, you actually see that the fundamental universe is very much relative. Like recently I just read this article this morning talking about how um they were saying that Newton might have been wrong. Like the idea, of course, there's I'm not going to get into that, but the idea that the universe is in itself a thing, and space and time therefore is like an objective thing. Even if you take all the objects out, you still have space and time. But people were saying that it's more relative, right? It may be like this person called Leibniz. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name correctly either. Who Einstein was inspired by, which states that space and time is a product of objects, right? Of objects existing, and so if you want to talk about universality, you have to get down to the idea of, is there an objective truth that you're kind of trying to discover, or is it more of like a relative type of thing, right, where the truth is relative to the people discovering it, or the existences, the type of realities that you're getting into. um I don't know, there's a lot that I'm getting to just from this one word, but I think it's important because if you're saying that philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality, which includes in itself in particular, I see that they're more, yeah, it's maybe already starting off on I'm not going to say a wrong foot, but on a different kind of path than I would think philosophy starts off on. Because to me, again, I'm just an amateur. Who am I to say? But to me, philosophy is like the practice of just thinking about these things, these sciences, these factors of the universe that we can observe and that we can think about, and trying to get a better understanding of things, and realizing that our understanding of the universe is in and of itself subjective to our own perspective, right? Even with our machines, even with our tools that are meant to measure objectively, um, it's still not objective, right? Because we built these tools. They're built with our understanding of how reality works, and we could be completely wrong. And we kind of discovering that the more we measure, the more we discover, the more we're seeing that our understanding of what is out there is completely, there's a way more out there than we think. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just completely off base.
Factor. On the other hand, In the ordinary view of anatomy, for instance, say the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as inanimate, we are quite sure that we do not as yet possess the subject matter itself, the content of this science, but must in addition exert ourselves to know the particulars. Further, in the case of such an aggregate of information which has no right to bear the name of science, an opening talk about aim and other such generalities is usually conducted in the same historical and uncomprehending way in which the content itself, these nerves, muscles, etc., is spoken of.
Mm.
In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that, along with the employment of such a method, its inability to grasp the truth would also be demonstrated.
Oh, this
Rise
is
to the
interesting.
incongruity that, along with the employment of such a method, its inability to grasp the truth would also.
Trying to see what this is saying. I know I'm reading it, but it's like taking time in my head for it to, to kind of land. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that, along with the employment of such a method, its inability to grasp the truth would also be demonstrated. So are they saying like philosophy can't grasp that truth? Um, because even like in hard sciences, like anatomy and things like that, sure, there's an understanding of how it works. But like I said before, with any science, you begin to realize that how you thought you were understanding before could be completely wrong, right? Like they constantly learning more about biology today, in which, well, granted, this is the time. I'm not sure when this was written. This may have been written before freaking, cells were discovered. So I know before they had this idea that, oh, we're at the end of science. We've discovered everything. So I don't know. Maybe this was written in that time, but what we're discovering today is that when you, like, even with biology, even though you think anatomy is something as simple that we know everything that's going on in your body, we are discovering that there's far more, things going on than we can possibly currently grasp, right? um like when you, I don't know if I should get into it right now because I'm not supposed to be taking so long. Just this is just a preface. I don't know, just I'll continue. Let's see where this
Also be
goes. Where this
demonstrated.
goes. Explanation and commentary on the text by Gregory B. Sadler. That's the dude watching this
This
video.
first paragraph in the Phenomenology is quite famous for Hegel's insistence that
Hegel.
really you can't write a
Oh, it
preface
was Hegel talking.
as the
Okay.
first thing that he's saying, writing his preface. So a lot of people have played around with this, and Derrida, for example, made a lot of hay out of this, talking about the impossibility of Hegel's own position.
I heard of
But
Derrida. I
Hegel
have to
really
read him next.
is earnest about this. What you're going to find is that he can be quite sardonic. He can be quite ironic. He can make a lot of very biting comments, withering sometimes, throughout this preface, because he's looking at other philosophical approaches of his own time and showing where they're wanting, showing where they've fallen short, showing where they thought they got it right, but actually only partly got it right, and thinking that they got the whole of it right, got it wrong.
Mm.
And
That's a great point right there, because shoot, man, like I see that all the time where, you know, people, whether it's scientists or just, designers or coders, any pretty much any human, right, has this idea of like, oh yes, we grasped this concept, we understand what's going on here, and then somebody else would like, oh no, but you missed this. And it turns out that thing's a huge part of, when you learn, you get more data, and it completely changes, it completely blows your, hypothesis out of the water. So the question then is, are you going to stick with your initial thought, or are you going to change when you find that new information, right? And that's really important. um so I think, if that's what he's saying here, that's very apropos there. That's pretty very cool.
this is something that actually, if you take away Hegel from it and take away his own particular way of doing philosophy, I think that quite a bit in this very first part of the preface would actually still make quite a good bit of sense when we're thinking about how philosophy differs from other disciplines, let alone differs from other genres of literature. So he starts out, wondering, can you actually write a preface to a philosophical work? Now, what does that mean? We're talking about a work that, in some way, is going beyond the sorts of things that we're normally looking at. A work of philosophy, for example, cannot be what we used to call a coffee table book. Those nicely illustrated large books that you set on the coffee table. Why would we call them a coffee table book? Because they're the kind of books that somebody would sit at a coffee table, and while they're sipping some coffee, maybe killing some time, they could page through.
Mm.
Philosophical works are not like that. You have
In a way, you
to
could just page through a
apply
philosophy.
yourself to them because
Yeah.
somebody else, in writing them, applied themselves. They work in the medium of complex and articulate thought. At least that's if they're good philosophy. If they're just, regurgitated dogmatic statements, that's not really philosophy in the sense
Mhm.
that Hegel is talking about. So, can a preface, can some sort of, here's what is going on,
Like a
here's what
minute
to
left. I might just keep
expect,
this going for
can
about five
that
minutes
sort
more or
of
something.
thing, that sort of warning, that sort of advertisement be effectively written? For philosophy, Hegel says, no, it's actually inappropriate and misleading. And this should give us some pause because he, like I said, he himself is writing a preface, and
So funny.
philosophical works generally have a preface, a foreword, an introduction. Oftentimes, they're not even by the person who wrote them; they're by somebody else who's connected with them or famous, and you get them to write the piece. So, what is Hegel actually driving at? Why does he say this? He says, whatever we might appropriately say about philosophy in a preface is not going to work.
Mm.
What are the sorts of things that we usually say in a preface? Hegel uses this term um, historical. And he doesn't just mean in the sense of history books or history courses or history as a discipline. He's
This is
using
really
this in a
interesting. I
broader
might have to
sense
keep
to
this going for a
mean
little bit.
something like a narrative. If you look at a lot of books' prefaces, you see things like, I never would have written this book except for having gone to this conference and then having got a grant from this institution or agency, and then this person got me thinking about that. And all of those things are rather contingent. Um, they're accidental. They could be fatefully accidental, to use the great skeptic and hermeneutic scholar Odo McCard's phrase, um, but they're contingent. There's no internal necessity in them. If you were to ask somebody, well, why'd you write this book? They could say, well, let me tell you this story about how the book got written. And that's all fine for radio interviews
Hmm.
and for
It kind of reminds me of the problem with the Robert Frost poem, two roads not road not traveled or something like that, right? Two roads diverge, and I walked the one less traveled. When you actually read that poem, you realize that he wasn't saying that you literally walk down the road less traveled. He's saying that there's two roads and they were equally the same. And it was only like in hindsight when you look back when you asked about it, decades in the future, that you went back and said, "Oh yes, I went down the road less traveled because that was brought me here." But in reality, when you were actually in the crossroads, you just made a choice. It didn't really matter. Like you had no idea which one is going to be which. They both look basically the same, and you retroactively, kind of romanticize your journey there. And so I guess what he's saying here is that when you're writing a book, it's the same principle. People can say, "Oh, why'd you write that book?" And you say, "Oh, yes, I wrote it because I wanted to explain this concept, or because I went to this school." Or when in actuality, you probably just wrote that book because you just wanted to write the book, right? You just wanted to, share your thoughts, and that's cool and all. You want to share your thoughts, and you had this idea that you wanted to get out, but in reality, we kind of make up the reasons why we do things after the fact. And this is interesting too, because this goes back into neuroscience, where we actually see in the brain, like when people make a conscious decision, their unconscious mind or their subconscious mind, whatever you call it, made the decision before they were consciously aware of it, and their conscious mind just came up with the reasons for it. They've done multiple tests like that, and it's so fascinating to see that kind of shown even in like the macro scale of philosophy and writing books and taking paths and all this other stuff. I just find that so incredibly interesting how all these different things are just interconnected, and that's why I think like it's so almost impossible to get to an objective or universal idea of the world, because we currently have no way of, like, our brain, I don't think our brains are really set up to understand how everything interconnects. Right, I'm reading this right now with my own set of kind of theories and background and understanding and perspective and all this other stuff in my time, zone or whatever, my era, my time era. And Hegel, wrote this in his own time with his own backgrounds, and this dude is explaining it in his own, experience and background and time. So it's just interesting how everything just interconnects, and this is exactly why I kind of want to do this series and kind of explain or talk about my own things, even though I'm retroactively also kind of adding to, my stories. That I don't know. I just wanted to share my thoughts as I learn something. I think it would be cool. And somebody else can look at this and have their own kind of ideas of how they're learning and what I'm thinking, what he's thinking, and what Hegel's thinking, and all this other stuff. And it's just that's just that's a beautiful aspect of humanity and knowledge. Unfortunately, you might have to leave it there. You know what? No, I've been making short videos all week. Even though it's only 3 videos, I'm gonna keep this going for another 15 minutes because I do have a call at 20 minutes. So I'm gonna keep this going for a little 15 minutes to see. Let's see how it goes. 'Cause this is fascinating.
Meet the author sort of things. But when we want to know why did you write this book of philosophy, we don't want to hear Hegel things. We don't want to hear, well, I think I had a book in me that needed to get out, or I had these experiences and it got me reflecting. We want to hear something more general, something that's not so contingent, something that is, in certain respects, more universal. So,
Hmm.
um,
But there is
what else do
is
we
there a
often
universal?
find in
Like you can't have
references?
anything that's universal, right?
Let's call them generalities and watered down
Watered down.
myths, bon mots, to good words, to use a certain way of parodying this. Oftentimes you'll see them, engaging. They'll say, in this book, I'm really concerned with the development of religion in the last 2 centuries in America. And here's the things I was really interested in. Obviously, I'm going to do more of this in the work itself, but really big picture, here's what I'm about. Well, that's pretty general. Notice that's not universal in any sort of philosophical sense. It's just kind of general. And it doesn't tell you much of anything. So for a philosophical work, what would you say? You know, think about Plato's dialogues. If they had a preface to them, let's say he had a preface to the Republic,
You have to
it would
read
run
or check
something
those
like
out
this.
too.
Well, these people got together. Socrates is going down to the Piraeus. So there's the historical part. And then he got roped into a conversation that they wouldn't let him out of. Unfortunately, there happened to be this firebrand Thrasymachus there, some more contingent stuff. And then they started talking about justice. And justice is a topic that's very important to all of us, and we should all be highly concerned with it. Now, there are different theories of justice available, and this book will discuss some of them. We might summarize them as might makes right, or egoism, or virtue ethics. And you notice they're throwing around terms, and they're saying, here's what we're going to do in this book.
Hmm.
But they're not actually doing it. They're just referencing it. They're just generalizing about what's going on. They're not actually giving you any of the meat. And you might say, well, it's a preface. What do you expect? But Hegel is saying, look, a work that's going to be philosophical has to have a philosophical preface as well. That's why it's so hard. So then
Okay.
he says, philosophy, it moves essentially in the element of universality, and he says universality includes within itself the particular. Now, this is something that's very important in terms of Hegel's own uh,
Hmm.
philosophical
Universality includes a
approach,
particular.
and I want to stress this at the beginning because this is going to come up over and over again. So, philosophy. So, really, what we need to do is not just contrast the universality with the particular, but I'll put two particulars down here.
Two particular.
And why am I putting two particulars down here? To signify that what we're dealing with is a whole range of particulars that are supposed to somehow come under the rubric of the universal. This is what
Hmm.
allows us. This provides us with intelligibility. This is what we actually experience.
Hmm. See where he's
And
going here.
I'm going to use this word an awful lot because it's a central part of Hegel's idea. There's a dialectic, there's a back and forth relationship between the universal that allows us to understand things and the particulars, which is what we actually experience.
Hmm.
Both of them require each other. No particulars, no universal. No universal, no particulars as such. Just an amorphous mass of, as James called it, blooming, buzzing confusion.
Hmm. So if I understand correctly, saying that universality is this idea of the common understanding, right? What we all can kind of, if you kind of put it in like a physics sense, it's like what we all can measure. Like we all can share. You might not know of a objective truth, like a 100. There's something that's universally true everywhere for everyone all the time, whatever. But we can kind of agree on, hey, we might share this perspective. We might share this understanding of the world or of you know what we can see, what we can measure. Like we can share at least some of this stuff. It might not be everything that's out there, but it's we can at least agree that this is what exists right now. This is what we can see. This is what we can measure right now, and that makes it intelligible, so that you and I can have a conversation, right, about an idea like justice or an idea like morals or whatever. We can have that conversation about those things because we share that universal concept of what justice is, even though justice itself might not be in itself objective, right? It might not be an objective truth per se. It might not be one definition of what justice is. But when we say justice, we both have a common understanding of vaguely what we mean, right? And that common understanding comes down to our individual experiences, our particulars, right? I can have an individual experience of justice. You can have your own experience. But even though we might each have different experiences, you can share that they have the same concept. I guess that's kind of how I'm understanding this so far. If so, that's very interesting. That's not what I realized that concept meant of universality or whatever. So this is really cool.
You need both of these. Philosophy is particularly connected with universality. It's aimed at trying to figure out, well, what are the universals and what can we know about them and how are they connected to them
Mm-hmm.
and are they connected to each other in such a way that perhaps one is a universal of universals?
Mm.
These are the sorts of things that philosophy has to be concerned with, according to Hegel. So he says, it might seem that here, more than in the other sciences, and when we see this word science, this is another thing I should probably say. Philosophy is one of the sciences. It is also science as such, the science of sciences for Hegel. And the German word for this is Wissenschaft. And when you think about science in an American or Anglo-American setting, the word is a bit deceptive for us when we're reading Hegel. because we tend to associate science with what are properly called the natural sciences as
Mm.
opposed to the social or human sciences, the Geisteswissenschaft in German, or the sciences humaines in French. Um, so there's this tendency to pull up science a little bit short. The other thing that you got to remember about this, and this is a historical point, something from the history of ideas, is that the term science and its narrowing occurred in late modernity.
Mm.
So much of what um, they were willing to call science at the time, people would talk about history as being science. They would talk about not
Mm.
just economics, the dismal science, but psychology and even philosophical psychology as being a science. So all of that fits under this. So philosophy is supposed to be scientific, and he says even its complete nature were expressed in the aim and final results. The execution would be the unessential factor. So if a preface is supposed to, again, be truly philosophical and philosophy is a matter of science, then it should be just sort of reporting, here's what I actually found out, here's what I'm proving, here's the case I'm making, here's what we've attained,
Almost
these are
like
the
an abstract
results.
to a science
And then he
paper.
says, now, wait a second. If we were to look at another science, one of the ones that was growing, by the way, at that time, anatomy, says the ordinary view of anatomy, parts of the body um, are looked at as things that we have knowledge of. And if we only know universal, but we don't know the particulars, then we don't say that we've actually got the science.
Hmm.
We know some of the general principles. You know, here'd be a great example. Why isn't Wikipedia a substitute, or any other encyclopedia for that matter? Why isn't that a substitute for actually taking classes on the subject? Because in the classes, you don't just learn information about particulars, you actually grapple with particulars and thereby see how the universal plays out in relation to particulars. It's one
Hmm.
thing to have a book sense of universals. It's another thing to actually apply it in real concrete cases and see how messy it gets and see how you have to sort of re-understand the universal principles or approach. In this case, you have to acquire, some judgment about it. And
Mm.
that's part of acquiring knowledge. So we
Yeah, that's a really important point right there. It's like knowledge is so messy. We might think we know something. Like I said, that the idea about justice is like, if I have an understanding of what justice is to me, because I've experienced some, feeling things in my life, and you've experienced different things in my life, in your life. We might share an idea of what justice is, but if we try to define justice by, blah blah blah, where is that going to lie under? Is that going to lie under my experiences, your experiences, a kind of amalgamation of both? Like how, and the more people that each bring their own experiences into it, the more kind of fuzzy that definition is. And even if you get to a really good definition of what justice is or what anything is, the truth is that that definition in and of itself is cannot cannot hold all of these experiences, right? It just can't. That's the kind of limitations of language. um that it's a mental model, right? And all mental models are false, but some are useful, right? It's a useful idea for what this thing means, but when it comes down to the practical everyday experience of it, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of um kind of understanding of how it's applied in different situations for different people and all that stuff. And so you have to take time to get that understanding, to practice that, to take a concept and to see what it means in your life and somebody else's life, and how we can still always kind of come back to that universal idea. So yeah, this is incredible. Yeah.
wouldn't think that somebody who just knew the general principles of anatomy actually understood anatomy. We didn't say that they possess the subject matter itself. they have to get to know the particulars. In the case of anatomy, probably you need to do some dissections, or at
Mm-hmm.
least trace out where the muscles and bones lie. So if philosophy is like that, what does that mean for philosophy?
You got to
Here's
practice
a
that
good question
philosophy
to
as you
ask
learn it.
yourself. Could you read just the phenomenology and not have to engage the rest of the great works of philosophy? I think Hegel would actually say no.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Right.
Because if you actually want to grasp what he's talking about in all these dialectical shifts and changes, you would want to know something at least about some of the works that he's grappling with and the developments that are taking place. So he says, in the case of an aggregate of information, which has no right to bear the name science, an opening talk about aim and other generalities is usually carried out in this sort of historical way. Here's what we've usually been up to, and here's the contingent things that we're interested in. In the case of philosophy, this would mean that there would be an incongruity, there would be a disconnect.
Hmm.
And what that would produce is a non-philosophical, and what that would amount to is an anti-philosophical way of approaching philosophy itself. I see this happen quite often in the way that philosophy gets taught. I've been guilty of that myself sometimes. Sometimes in trying to oversimplify, we lose the spirit of what it is that we're doing in philosophy. The
Hmm.
philosophy really is the sort of thing that Hegel makes it out to be, where it's this totalizing discipline that really makes sense out of everything. Would we really have an intro to philosophy text that would be adequate to that aim, to that scope?
Hmm.
Probably not. It'd be very difficult to design it.
Right.
So
You got to just get into everything.
that's why
It's a constant process of learning.
Hegel can't write the preface, which he's about to write.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, that was cool. That was cool. So that was very interesting already. Just like that first paragraph, whatever that was. Um, Shoot, I'm excited for this whole series, and I hope you're excited to, you know, go with me on this journey. Probably going to be years in the making if we stick with it, because he has a lot of. I think it's still going. He started in 2014. So yeah, this is going to be interesting. But yeah, thanks for watching. Um, you can always go check it out yourself and go just read through it or watch through it yourself if you don't want to hear me um, trying to struggle through this. But I love this stuff. It's so interesting to me. So yeah, I'm happy to have found that, and I'm really excited to get into it some more. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.